All right, so here we go with Evolution Screencast 2, Part 2. Looking at Darwin's theory of natural selection. What is natural selection? We said survival of the fittest. The individuals that are more well suited for their environment are going to be the ones that survive and reproduce. This acts on a range of phenotypes, not individuals. And that's because if we looked at it from an individual point of view, like let's compare two grasshoppers. If there was a brown grasshopper and a green grasshopper, and the green grasshopper was selected for and the brown grasshopper was selected against, then it is what it is, right? The green grasshopper survives and the brown one does not. That doesn't really tell us the big picture. With evolution, we want to look at change in population over time. Remember, population is all of the species that live in an area. It's not a community. A community is like, think of the Lion King. When they're all around Pride Rock, you have the lions and the hippos and the zebras. That is a community. A population is all members of a single species that live in an area. That's what we're looking at when we're looking at evolution. And it acts on a range of phenotypes. Think of a phenotype as like a trait. You have your DNA code blueprint, which is your genotype. A phenotype is the physical manifestation of your genotype. So like my phenotype for hair color would be brown. My phenotype for hair like style would be wavy, whereas someone else could have blonde straight hair. So phenotypes are physical manifestations of your genotype. With natural selection, we're looking at how these phenotypes are selected for or selected against. The ones that are more favorable for the environment are going to be the ones that are selected for. Those that aren't more favorable are going to be selected against. We're looking at the change in gene frequencies over time. That way, we're going to create new phenotypes. We're going to create new traits if we're changing the genes over time. How can that change occur? A couple of different ways. Random mutations is probably going to be the one that's most relevant to our conversation here. And then when you get more advanced in biology and evolutionary studies, you'll probably look at environmental changes, radiation, and chemicals a little bit more. But I think the bulk of what we cover in ninth grade biology is just looking at random mutations. I've also said this word a lot, adaptations, but we haven't really defined it yet. An adaptation is an inherited characteristic, meaning it's passed on from parent to offspring. That's going to increase an organism's chance for survival. An adaptation that we're looking at here is this orchid mantis. The orchid mantis blends in very nicely with the orchid that it lives on. That way, predators are not able to see it, and prey aren't able to see it either. That way, the orchid mantis can sneak up on its prey relatively easily. Other adaptations, there's a lot of adaptations you can think of probably just off the top of your head right now. It could be a behavior, like if an organism is a solitary hunter versus if it's more of like a prey organism, it's probably going to be in a herd. That would be like some behavioral examples. Sound examples, think of like a songbird trying to attract a mate. Appearance, camouflage, blending in with its environment. The fact that polar bears have really thick fur to keep them warm, hibernation, lots and lots of adaptations. If these adaptations are favorable, it's going to become more common in a species. Again, if it's favorable, remember, survival of the fittest. We looked at physical adaptations, speed, camouflage, claws, quills, behavioral, if it is a solitary hunter or animal, if it is in herds, packs, activity level. You can look at tons and tons of different adaptations. They're pretty easy to pick out. Really, if you think about it, any organism that's alive today is going to have some sort of adaptation for it to be able to have evolved over billions of years. And individuals don't pick and choose their adaptations. They're qualities that are present in a population if they're favorable, they're selected for. Mimicry is a really cool adaptation. An example that I think of whenever I think of mimicry is the viceroy butterfly and monarch butterfly. A viceroy butterfly is toxic for milkweed bugs, which eat them or try to eat them, but the viceroy does not have that same toxic substance. So the viceroy has adapted itself to look just like a monarch butterfly. I know that's not the image that's here, but if you look that up, then you'll see that the monarch butterfly and the viceroy look a lot alike. So the viceroy, since it's harmless, is mimicking the harmful monarch. Camouflage is probably one we're more familiar with. It's an organism's ability to blend in with its environment. Lots of fish use this, crabs, bugs, snakes. Lots of organisms use camouflage. Try to think of some on your own. What are some organisms that use camouflage as a survival tactic or adaptation? Natural selection, certain variations in a population are going to survive, reproduce, pass their genes on to the next generation. This is going to take a long time usually. There are some cases of evolution where you can see results very quickly. A lot of studies with fruit flies or Drosophila, you can see the results very quickly because they have such short life cycles. But for the most part, when we're looking at plants and animals that are alive on Earth today, this process has taken place over millions of years, billions actually. So here's just some important notes. If a species doesn't adapt, it doesn't survive. This isn't going to happen during an individual's lifetime, but it's going to pass these favorable traits on to its offspring. Natural selection does not give organisms what they need. It's a really long process, like I talked about before, where certain variations are more favorable and therefore selected for. And the major mechanism behind the process of natural selection is genetic variation. It's going to act on natural selection is going to act on more favorable phenotypes, and genes or genetics, which again are inherited, are going to be responsible for the phenotypes or physical traits. So your genotype affects your phenotype. The difference between natural selection and artificial selection. Artificial selection is when we as humans are selecting traits that we find favorable. For example, ancient corn looks a lot different than modern corn looks. And we selected the largest kernels in order to have larger corn kernels for us to be able to eat. Another example would be selected breeding of dogs. We want certain dogs to have certain traits. We're going to choose dogs that have that trait and breed two similar dogs that have that trait together. You can do the same thing for cats to come up with hairless varieties. Cattle, horse racing, we're going to breed the two fastest horses together in order to have them have an offspring that is even faster. That's selective breeding. So that's different than natural selection. You can kind of tell by the name. Natural selection is something that's happening that's governed by nature. It's a natural process, whereas selective breeding or artificial selection is when humans are getting involved and choosing organisms that have more favorable traits for our benefit. Darwin published The Origin of Species November 24th, 1859. He initially didn't want to ruffle any feathers, so he only shared his research with a few people. Then Alfred Russel Wallace was coming up with similar ideas. So then a geologist named Charles Lyell urged Darwin, you need to publish this before Alfred Russel Wallace gets the credit. The main critique of Darwin's work is this is all fine and dandy, but how is this happening? How could favorable variations be passed on to future generations? There was just a missing link there. That part didn't make sense. Like they understood that more favorable traits are better for these organisms, but it still doesn't make sense how this is happening. Then Mendel came along and explained heredity. And then it was like everything kind of fell into place and everything clicked. Well, these traits are embedded in genes, and those genes are passed on to offspring. So that's what I said in the last screencast. Modern science, as it evolved, every major breakthrough has helped support and strengthen Darwin's theory of natural selection. I talked about this too in my email this morning, April 17th. It's This image is used all the time. When people think of evolution, this is probably the first image that pops in their head, which is sort of unfortunate because I guess it depends on how you interpret it. But by looking at this image, it seems like we went from this primate to this primate to this primate human hybrid or hominid to this maybe Neanderthal or some other primordial human to Homo sapiens. This isn't what's happening. We're not going from one to the other in a stepwise pattern. That's just a major misconception. That's like we can't say, oh, how cool, humans came from a daffodil. I just looked out my window and saw one, that's why I said that. That's just not true. We didn't evolve from a daffodil. We didn't evolve from a fish. We didn't evolve from a whale. However, we share a common ancestor millions, if not billions, of years back. So we shared a common ancestor, but then we diverged, from that common ancestor. And that's how all these different lineages and all these different clades of organisms came to be. So it's not saying that one happened right after the other, because that wouldn't make sense anyway, because if we say that humans came from chimps, well, if humans came from chimps, then there wouldn't be chimps anymore because we came from them. So it doesn't make sense. What is more correct to say, or what is correct to say, is humans and chimps share a common ancestor. And the more closely related two organisms are, the more recently they share a common ancestor. So we share common ancestors with chimps. I've seen estimates from like 4.5 to 6 million years ago, versus if we look at some sort of plant, that would probably be more like a billion years ago. The more closely related two organisms are, the more recently they share a common ancestor, and the less closely related they are, they're going to share a common ancestor a lot further back. And what's important to understand here, instead of a lineage, it is more of like a branching tree rather than a stepwise pattern of one species evolved from another. And then we have descent with modification. Darwin proposed the idea of common ancestors, and that as species evolve from their common ancestors, they change over time, and that's what causes an evolution of a new species. This can take place over really, really long periods of time. We can look at natural selection. It's observed when we see changes in the body structures of different species, the niches that the different species live in, their habitats and behaviors. And natural selection can be observed in all those different things, because all of these, think of them like different traits, right? So these different behavioral patterns or habitats that they live in, or body structures, they're going to be different traits, and depending on if an organism was more well suited for that environment or behavior, then they're going to survive and reproduce. This occurs over a really long period of time, like I said. A lot of species are going to look a lot different today than their common ancestor was going to look. So this looks like the common ancestor of a camel, and you can see that there's a lot of changes that occurred through this camel, or ancient camel, I guess I should say. We looked at the whale example pretty heavily in the last class. Again, or the last screencast. There's a lot of change from Ambulocetus to modern whales. And it doesn't mean that you went from this to this to this to this, right? This was just the common ancestor. A lot of divergence has occurred since then. All right, so we only have a few more slides after this, so we'll pick up there in the third and final screencast.